December 14th, 1944, Fort Chaffee. Arkansas, 07:18 a.m. Sunday arrived without ceremony. There was no bell that marked it as different from any other day, no announcement, no flag raised higher than usual. The cold morning light crept through the gaps in the wooden barracks the same way it always did, thin and pale, settling on wool blankets and tired faces. She woke when the woman on the bunk below shifted her weight, and the boards creaked a sound she had come to recognize as the unofficial reveille of the camp. For a moment, just a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the smell of damp wood, boiled coffee grounds, and disinfectant returned her to Arkansas. December 1944. The war had been grinding on for more than 5 years. In Germany, there were no days anymore, only stretches of survival broken by sirens. Sundays had disappeared some time after the first heavy bombings. Church bells were silent. Bakeries were empty. The idea of rest had become irrelevant when hunger did not pause and fear had no calendar. She sat up, pulled on her coat, and tied her boots with fingers that still felt clumsy in the cold. Around her, the other women moved quietly without conversation. Habit had replaced hope. Today would be like yesterday. Roll call, work detail, thin meals, waiting. That was what captivity meant. That was what she had prepared herself for. Outside, the camp was already awake. Guard towers stood against the pale sky, unmoving. A few American soldiers walked their posts with hands tucked into their jackets, breath visible in short clouds. Somewhere beyond the fences, trucks moved along a distant road, engines steady, unhurried. The world outside did not sound like it was at war. The line to the mess hall formed as it always did. Metal trays stacked near the entrance. A familiar clatter. No shouting. No dogs. She noticed that, as she often did. The Americans did not shout unless they had to. She stepped inside and stopped. The first thing that reached her was not the sight, but the smell. Warm, sweet, rich. Her body reacted before her mind could make sense of it. Her stomach tightened sharply, not from hunger alone, but from confusion. She had smelled this before, years ago, somewhere far away from fences and uniforms. It took her a second to place it. Butter. She looked up. On the serving counter were stacks of pancakes, thick and uneven steam rising gently from their surfaces. A man in an apron flipped another batch on a griddle, the sound soft and rhythmic. To the side sat metal tubs filled with butter already melting at the edges and glass jars of jam, red, purple, golden, each with its own spoon resting inside. Coffee was being poured from a large metal urn, dark and hot, filling tin cups with a familiar, almost comforting sound. For a heartbeat, no one moved. She felt the women behind her slow, then stop entirely. The line stalled. Someone inhaled sharply. Another whispered something in German too quietly to catch. This was not what a prison meal looked like. She had imagined watery soup. A slice of bread measured too carefully. Something gray and tasteless meant to sustain life, but not dignity. That was what she had braced herself for since the day of her capture. That was what propaganda had promised. This looked like a table prepared for guests. She scanned the room, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. But nothing happened. American soldiers stood near the walls, relaxed, their rifles slung casually. One leaned against a post, laughing as another said something about the weather turning colder by next week. Someone else complained about a football game played the night before, shaking his head as if the outcome personally offended him. No one was watching the prisoners. No one was counting. She took another step forward, then another, the metal tray cold and heavy in her hands. The smell followed her, persistent and undeniable. Pancakes were placed on trays without comment. Butter was added generously. A spoonful of jam landed slightly off-center, then another as if abundance were an inconvenience rather than a statement. She felt dizzy. This was Sunday. She knew that because somewhere deep inside her, her body remembered what Sundays used to mean. Before the war, before the ration cards, before standing in lines that never moved fast enough. Sundays had once smelled like this. They had once sounded like plates being set and chairs pulled back like quiet conversation instead of air raid sirens. She stood frozen at the edge of the serving counter, her tray suddenly too heavy to lift. A question rose in her chest before she could stop it. "Is this a holiday?" The words came out softly, almost apologetically, as if she were asking permission to misunderstand what she was seeing. The American interpreter, a young man with tired eyes and a voice that suggested he had been explaining the same things for months, turned toward her. He glanced at her tray, then at the counter, then back at her face. "No," he said after a brief pause. "Just Sunday breakfast. Nothing else. No explanation, no emphasis, no sense that this moment carried weight beyond the practical matter of feeding people who were hungry. Just Sunday." The line moved again. She walked to a table and sat down slowly as though the floor might shift beneath her. Around her, other women stared at their trays. Some touched the food cautiously. Some did nothing at all. One woman pressed her fingers into the butter, then wiped them quickly on her sleeve as if afraid of leaving evidence. She did not eat, not yet. She watched. Across the room, American soldiers carried identical plates to their own tables. They ate quickly, talking over one another, cutting pancakes in uneven pieces. One poured too much syrup and laughed as it spilled onto the table. Another offered a bite to a friend who refused with a grimace and kept chewing. It struck her then not as a realization but as a disturbance. This was not a performance. No one was trying to impress anyone. No one was trying to teach a lesson. This was simply how they lived. Outside the fences, she knew factories were running day and night. Trains carried steel and fuel and food across a continent untouched by bombs. Farms still produced more than enough. Families still gathered on Sundays. While Europe was being reduced to rubble, America was eating breakfast. The thought was almost unbearable. She lowered her gaze to the pancakes in front of her. Steam curled upward, faint and insistent. The smell did not fade. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the tray, careful not to spill anything. This was not what she had been told captivity would be, and that, more than hunger or fear, unsettled her most. She kept her hands on either side of the tray, fingers curled against the metal as if anchoring herself to the table might keep the room from tipping. The pancakes sat where they had been placed untouched. Steam thinned and faded. Butter softened into pale pools along their edges. The smell that had first stunned her now felt heavier, almost oppressive, as though it were pressing against her chest and asking something of her she was not prepared to give. She did not eat, not because she was not hungry, because hunger, she had learned, was dangerous. In Germany, hunger had been a lever. It had been used to teach obedience, to sharpen fear, to remind people where power lived. Food arrived when you complied. It disappeared when you questioned. Rations shrank without warning. A mistake at work, a careless word overheard, a name written down in the wrong ledger, each could mean less bread the following week. She had learned early that nothing nourishing came without a condition. And this was too nourishing. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, cataloging details the way she had been trained to do during inspections. The American guards stood where they had stood a moment before. No one had shifted into position. No doors had closed. No voices had risen. Still she waited. She told herself it was a test, that this was how it began. Offer comfort. Let it soften resistance. Then take it away. She had seen it done. Her mother once came home with a small sack of potatoes she had obtained through a favor, an unspoken exchange that required no receipt. They ate well that week. The next week, the man who had helped them was gone and the ration office reduced their allocation without explanation. Her mother never spoke of it again. She simply cooked thinner soups and cut slices smaller. Food always remembered what you owed. She reached for her fork, then stopped halfway. Around her, the other women were frozen in similar hesitation. Some stared down at their trays as if waiting for them to vanish. Others watched the guards measuring their expressions for the slightest shift. One woman across the table lifted her cup of coffee, held it just beneath her nose, then set it down untouched. No one spoke. The room, which had moments ago felt alive with movement, now seemed suspended in a careful quiet. She broke a small corner from one pancake, the movement so deliberate it felt ceremonial. The piece was barely larger than her thumbnail. She held it between two fingers and brought it closer. The smell intensified, sweet, warm, unmistakably real. She inhaled once, then again. Her stomach responded immediately, a sharp, almost painful contraction that made her jaw tighten. She had not eaten like this in years, not even close. The body remembered what the mind tried to suppress. She lowered the piece back onto the tray. If it was poisoned, this was how it would begin. Something small, something that could be explained away as weakness if anyone collapsed. If it was a trap, she would not be the first to step into it. She waited for someone else to prove it safe. At the far end of the room, an American soldier sat with his back to the wall, boots stretched out beneath the table. He cut into his pancakes with quick, careless movements, talking as he ate. Syrup pooled on his plate and ran dangerously close to the edge. He didn't notice. Another soldier stood tray in hand, scanning the counter. "Hey," he called to the cook. "Can I get another one?" The cook glanced up, nodded once, and flipped another pancake onto the plate without comment. That was it. No hesitation. No questioning glance toward an officer. No calculation. Just more. The soldier returned to his table and sat down, already halfway through another mouthful, as if the matter were settled. He spoke with his mouth full, laughed at something his companion said, and kept eating. The sound of chewing carried farther than it should have. She felt something shift, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle the structure she had built inside herself. If this were a performance, it was a careless one. Too careless. No one was watching to see if the prisoners noticed the generosity. No one was gauging their reaction. The Americans were not acting. They were eating. She picked up her fork again. This time she pressed it lightly into the pancake, testing resistance, as if the texture might reveal the truth. It yielded easily. She lifted another small piece smaller than before. She paused. The room did not change. No whistles, no commands. No sudden attention drawn to her table. She brought the piece to her mouth and let it rest there for a second without biting her lips, barely touching it. The heat surprised her. It was still warm. Warmth was inefficient. Warmth required planning time care. Warmth was not something you wasted on prisoners. She bit down. The taste landed all at once, soft, sweet, impossibly familiar. It spread across her tongue and into her throat, triggering a physical response she could not control. Her eyes closed before she realized they had done so. Her shoulders tensed, then released slightly as if some internal brace had loosened by mistake. She forced herself to chew slowly. "Do not rush," she told herself. "Do not give in." She swallowed. Nothing happened. No dizziness, no burning, no sudden wave of nausea, just the quiet, undeniable fact of nourishment moving through her body. She waited another second, then another. Across from her, one of the women lifted her cup of coffee and took a cautious sip. Her expression tightened briefly, then softened into confusion. She stared into the cup as if expecting the liquid to change color. "It's just coffee," the woman murmured almost to herself. She took another bite, slightly larger this time. Her hands still trembled, but less noticeably now. The fear did not disappear. It never vanished all at once, but it fractured, splitting along a line she had not known existed. This was not how control worked. In Germany, meals were counted, observed, rationed with precision that left no room for comfort. Eating had become an act of calculation. Here, no one counted. No one watched to see how much she took or whether she finished. The Americans treated food the way they treated weather, something expected, reliable, unremarkable. She looked around the room again, seeing it differently now. The guards were not tense. Their posture lacked the tight vigilance she associated with authority that feared revolt. They leaned, shifted, spoke quietly among themselves. A man folded his newspaper and tucked it under his arm. Another checked his watch and sighed, already thinking about what came next. They were not afraid of the people they guarded. That realization unsettled her more deeply than any threat could have. She took another bite, then another, each one eroding something she had believed unmovable. The fear remained, but it had lost its clarity. It no longer pointed toward a single identifiable danger. Instead, it spread outward, becoming something more diffuse and harder to name. If this was not a trap, if this was not manipulation, then everything she had been taught about her enemy was incomplete at best. She lowered her fork and stared at the plate, now half empty. For years, fear had been a map. It told her where not to step, what not to trust, how to survive. Without it, she felt exposed, as though the ground beneath her might give way. She realized with a sudden tightness in her chest that fear had been easier than uncertainty. Around her, the room returned to motion. Trays scraped. Chairs shifted. Conversation resumed. The world continued unbothered by the quiet war being fought inside her. She took another bite slower this time and let the warmth settle. Nothing this normal should exist here, she thought, and yet it did. For several minutes after she swallowed the last bite, she did nothing. She sat with her hands resting flat on the table, palms down, as if any sudden movement might undo what had just happened. The fear had not vanished. It rarely did, but it had retreated enough to leave behind something more dangerous than panic. Awareness. She was still staring at her tray when a shadow crossed the table. At first, her body reacted before her mind. Her shoulders tightened. Her spine straightened. Years of training, formal and informal, told her that attention from authority was never accidental. She expected a reprimand, a question, perhaps a correction she had failed to anticipate. Instead, a voice spoke casually, almost lazily, from somewhere above her line of sight. "You don't like pancakes." She looked up. The American soldier stood a few steps away, tray tucked under one arm. He was young, younger than she had expected, with a face that looked unfinished, as if adulthood had been interrupted and redirected into uniform. His tone carried no accusation, no impatience. It was the same voice someone might use to ask about the weather or comment on a meal that hadn't turned out quite right. She hesitated. Words crowded her mouth and then retreated. English came slowly when she was anxious. Her gaze dropped briefly to the tray between them, then back to his face. Like she said carefully, unsure whether the sentence would hold. "I was not sure." He followed her glance, noticed the mostly untouched pancakes, the butter melting untouched into the plate. "Oh," he said, "just that." He stepped closer to the counter without another word, shifted his tray to the table beside her, and reached for one of the glass jars. The spoon clinked softly against the rim as he scooped out a generous portion of jam. He placed it on her plate slightly to the side, as though rearranging something that had simply been overlooked. "Try it with this," he said. "That's how my mom does it." Then he nodded once, as if the matter were resolved, and turned back toward his own table. She watched him walk away, unsure whether she had imagined the exchange. No one else reacted. No guard leaned closer. No one recorded the interaction. The room continued in its low, unremarkable rhythm, plates, moving chairs, scraping conversations, overlapping without urgency. The jam sat on her plate, bright and glossy, catching the light. He had not waited for her answer. He had not watched her reaction. He had not even looked back. She stared at the spoon resting in the jar across the room, then at the dollop of jam now slowly spreading into the warm pancake beneath it. In Germany, kindness had always announced itself. It arrived with conditions, with expectation, with memory. It was something you noticed because it was rare and because it required repayment. This had been different. There had been no pause, no emphasis, no moral weight placed on the gesture. It had not even seemed generous to him. It had been practical. almost thoughtless, as if this were simply what you did when someone hadn't eaten enough. She picked up her fork and pressed it gently into the jam. The color bled outward, staining the pancake beneath. She hesitated only a moment before lifting the bite to her mouth. The sweetness surprised her, not because it was intense, but because it was familiar. For a brief, disorienting instant, the mess hall disappeared. She was standing in a small kitchen with low ceilings and a window that faced the street. Morning light filtered through thin curtains. A radio played softly somewhere nearby, its signal steady and unbroken. Her mother stood at the stove, humming without realizing she was doing it, a pan warming slowly while butter melted too quickly at the edges. "Careful," her mother had said once, laughing as the butter slid too far. "I always use too much on Sundays." Sundays. Before uniforms. Before ration cards pinned to coats. Before learning how to sleep through sirens and eat without asking questions. She blinked and the memory loosened its grip. The mess hall returned solid and present. The walls were still there. The guards still leaned against them. The American soldiers still talked about ordinary things, one complaining about cold fingers, another about missing his sister's cooking back home. But something had shifted. She took another bite, then another, letting herself eat without scanning the room for consequences. The jam made the pancakes softer, richer, closer to what they had been meant to be. She wondered suddenly whether this was how it always was here, not just today, not just for show. Whether Sunday breakfast in America had always looked like this before the war, before Europe burned, before people like her learned to be suspicious of comfort. She watched the soldier who had spoken to her sit back down at his table. He poured more coffee, folded his newspaper, and resumed a conversation she could not hear. His back was turned to her now, and he showed no sign of remembering the exchange at all. That unsettled her more than anything else. If this kindness was intentional, it would have lingered. It would have demanded recognition. It would have been reinforced, perhaps even repeated. Instead, it dissolved back into routine. The idea took shape slowly, cautiously, as if afraid of being rejected. Maybe this was not kindness as she understood it. Maybe this was habit. A country that fed its children well did not know how to stop feeding people when they wore different uniforms. A culture that treated Sunday morning as something worth protecting did not suspend that belief at the edge of a prison camp. This was not mercy delivered from above. It was inheritance. She ate steadily now, no longer breaking the pancakes into tiny, testable pieces. Her movements remained careful, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Around her, the women followed at their own pace, some faster, some slower, but the silence that had dominated earlier gave way to soft murmurs. "It tastes like home," someone whispered almost guiltily. She did not respond, but the words stayed with her. Home. The thought no longer felt treacherous. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the empty plate. A faint sheen of syrup remained, catching the light. She resisted the impulse to wipe it clean with her finger, unsure whether that instinct came from hunger or nostalgia. Across the room, a bell rang lightly. Not an alarm, just a signal. People began to stand to gather trays to move on with the day. Sunday breakfast was over. No speeches followed. No lesson was delivered. The guards resumed their posts. The prisoners lined up to leave. As she stood, she glanced once more toward the counter, half expecting to see the jars removed, the warmth replaced with something more appropriate to captivity. Nothing changed. She walked out into the cold Arkansas morning, with the taste of jam still lingering, her mind turning over a thought that refused to settle. They hadn't meant to be kind. They had simply meant to have breakfast, and somehow that made all the difference. She did not break down when the fork first touched the pancake. That would have been too obvious, too expectatoire, but instead, she sat very still as though her body were waiting for instructions her mind had not yet given. The plate in front of her was warm now, only in places the butter having soaked in the jam spread unevenly where she had pressed it with the back of the spoon. The room around her had begun to empty, chairs scraping softly as people stood the ordinary end of an ordinary meal. It should have ended there, but her hands began to shake, not violently, not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough that she became aware of the effort required to keep the fork steady between her fingers. She tried to ignore it to will the sensation away, but the more she focused on control, the more her grip betrayed her. She took another bite. That was when it happened. The taste did not change. It was the same as before, soft, faintly sweet, warm in a way that had nothing to do with hunger alone. But something in her chest loosened, then gave way entirely, as if a knot she had been tightening for years had finally slipped. She did not cry, not at first. Her eyes blurred slightly and she blinked hard, annoyed at herself for such a reaction. This was food. This was nothing. She had survived worse than this. She had learned to stand in bomb shelters without flinching, to listen to sirens and count the seconds between explosions, to eat things she would never have believed edible. She had learned to endure, and yet her throat tightened and she could not swallow. The room around her began to recede, not vanish, but soften at the edges like an image left too long in sunlight. Sounds dulled. The clatter of trays, the low murmur of English voices, the scrape of boots on the floor, all blended into something distant and indistinct. In their place came another sound, paper rustling. She saw it clearly now without effort. Her father sat at the small kitchen table, the newspaper spread open in front of him, one hand smoothing the crease as he read. He wore his old sweater, the one with the frayed cuff he refused to replace. The radio was off. Sundays were for quiet. The world could wait. Her mother stood at the stove, back turned, stirring something slowly. She moved without urgency, unhurried in a way that had once seemed natural and inevitable. Butter melted too fast in the pan, hissing softly, and her mother laughed under her breath. "I always use too much," she said, not looking up. "Especially on Sundays." Sunlight came through the window at an angle that only appeared once a week, illuminating dust motes in the air. The table was set simply. No one rushed. No one counted. Sunday had meant safety. The memory struck with a force she had not anticipated, not because it was painful, but because it was intact, untouched, preserved in a part of her she had sealed off when the war demanded room for other things. She had not thought of it in years. Her hand trembled more noticeably now, the fork tapping softly against the plate. She set it down before it could fall. Her other hand closed slowly around the edge of the table, fingers pressing into the wood as if grounding herself in the present might keep the past from overwhelming her. Across from her, one of the women suddenly covered her mouth. A sharp, involuntary sound escaped her. Half breath, half sob. She turned away quickly, shoulders folding inward, her face lowered toward the tray as if she could disappear into it. Another woman beside her froze, then bowed her head, completely pressing her forehead against her clasped hands. No one spoke. No one needed to. The breakdown did not arrive all at once like a wave. It moved through the room in fragments, uneven and personal. A stiffening of posture here, a sharp inhale there, a tear wiped away too quickly to be acknowledged. These were women who had learned restraint as a matter of survival. Emotion had been dangerous. It slowed you down. It made you visible. But this slipped past all defenses. She felt her eyes sting, then burn. She blinked again, more urgently now, but the moisture gathered faster than she could push it away. Her vision blurred completely for a moment, and she lowered her head, not in shame, but in something closer to reverence. The pancakes were gone. The plate was empty. She stared at the faint smears left behind, traces of syrup, a streak of jam at the edge, and felt an unexpected ache settle behind her ribs. They ate like this. The thought formed slowly, each word weighted. They eat like this, even on Sundays. It was not a question meant for anyone else. It did not seek an answer. It was a realization that refused to fit neatly into the world she understood. In Germany, Sundays had been hollowed out by necessity. They had become quieter, yes, but not gentler. Shops closed not out of tradition but because there was nothing left to sell. Church bells fell silent, not out of reverence but because metal was needed elsewhere. The war had not only taken food, it had taken rhythm. It had taken the soft markers that told people who they were and when they were allowed to rest. Here in this place behind fences, Sunday still existed. Not as an idea, not as propaganda, as practice. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the motion quick and almost irritated. She resented the tears not because they were weak, but because they revealed something she had been trying not to name. Grief. Not for the present, but for what had been lost so gradually she had not noticed its absence until now. The women began to stand one by one, movement subdued, careful. Trays were collected. The line toward the exit reformed without instruction. Outside, the cold air waited unchanged. She rose more slowly than the others. As she turned toward the door, she caught sight of one of the American soldiers watching the room. Not intently, not suspiciously. His expression was neutral, perhaps faintly puzzled, as if he sensed something had occurred but did not understand its shape. He did not intervene. He did not comment. He simply held the door as they passed. She stepped outside and drew a breath that felt heavier than it should have. The sky above Fort Chaffee was pale and wide, untouched by smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded long and steady. The world went on, but something inside her had shifted irreversibly. Sunday used to mean home, and for the first time since the war began that truth felt close enough to hurt. The realization did not come to her all at once. It arrived slowly in the fragments over the hours that followed the breakfast she could not forget. Back in the barracks, the women moved through the rest of the morning with unusual quiet. There was no discussion of what had happened, no attempt to name it. They folded blankets, swept floors, lined up when told. Routine resumed, but something beneath it had loosened like a seam pulled just enough to be felt. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, not the food itself, but the absence of ceremony around it. No speeches, no warnings, no explanation. If it had been a reward, there would have been rules attached. If it had been psychological pressure, it would have come with observation. But no one had checked whether she finished her plate. No one had noted who cried or who did not. By mid-morning, the mess hall had been cleaned and reset ready for lunch as if the morning had held no significance at all. That was what unsettled her most. In Germany, nothing meaningful happened without intent. Strength had always been announced, paraded, enforced. Authority spoke loudly so that no one mistook its presence. Even generosity had been calculated, parceled out to inspire loyalty or fear in equal measure. Food had never simply been food. It had been leverage. She thought of the ration cards her mother kept folded inside a tin box, edges soft from handling. The careful way meals had been planned, measured, repeated, week after week. The constant awareness that something could be taken away without warning. That was how power worked where she came from. Here, power seemed to do the opposite. Later that afternoon, as they were led outside for a work detail, she watched an American truck pass beyond the fence. Two men sat in the cab laughing about something she could not hear. The back was stacked with crates, wooden, unmarked, ordinary. She knew what was inside without being told. Food, supplies, more than enough. The truck did not slow as it passed the camp. No one saluted it. No one guarded it with urgency. Abundance, she realized, did not need protection. The thought stayed with her as the day unfolded. An American guard paused to tighten a loose hinge on a gate instead of reporting it. Another lent his gloves to a prisoner whose hands were red from the cold, taking them back later without comment. None of these moments were remarkable on their own. That was the point. They were unremarkable because they were normal. She began to understand that the breakfast had not been a message meant for her. It had not been meant for anyone at all. Sunday breakfast was not a symbol. It was not a lesson. It was not an exception carved out for prisoners to demonstrate moral superiority. It was simply what happened on Sunday. That realization unsettled the last certainty she had been holding on to. If this was not strategy, if this was not theater, then it meant that America did not need to prove anything. Not to her, not to its enemies, not even to itself. The country she had been taught to fear had no need to exaggerate its strength. It did not need to shout or intimidate or ration dignity. It had already decided what kind of place it was long before the war forced that identity into view. She thought again of the soldier who had added jam to her plate. He had not paused to consider the implications. He had not weighed the political meaning of the gesture. He had not thought of it as mercy. He had thought of it as breakfast. That difference mattered more than any declaration of values ever could. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself noticing details she might once have dismissed. The way guards addressed one another by first name. The ease with which they joked even while working. The absence of ritual around authority orders given plainly without flourish. Strength here did not rely on fear to sustain itself. It relied on confidence. She realized with a tightening in her chest that this was why the Americans could afford to be humane. Not because they were naive, not because they underestimated their enemy, but because they were certain that feeding prisoners would not weaken them, certain that dignity was not a finite resource, certain that the outcome of the war did not hinge on denying pancakes to women behind fences. In Germany, uncertainty had infected everything. Scarcity bred suspicion. Fear demanded control. The system could not tolerate kindness without justification because it did not trust itself to survive it. Here, kindness existed without explanation. That night, lying on her bunk, she stared at the ceiling boards and listened to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. Somewhere, a radio played quietly an American voice reading news she could not fully understand. The war was moving closer to its end. She could feel it even without maps. She wondered how many Sunday breakfasts had been served like that one while the world burned elsewhere. How many families had gathered around tables complaining about cold coffee or overcooked eggs, unaware that the same food served without thought was dismantling years of propaganda inside a prison camp. She thought of the men who built this country's factories, who planted its fields, who raised children on routines strong enough to survive war. Men and women who believed that ordinary life was worth defending not with cruelty, but with consistency. This was the generation now fighting the war. Not heroes carved in stone, not slogans printed on posters. People who believed that Sunday should still feel like Sunday. The thought settled into her with unexpected weight. America did not defeat its enemies by becoming something monstrous. It defeated them by remaining itself. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes, aware that something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had once guided her had lost its authority. In its place was a quieter, more dangerous realization. A country that did not need to prove anything was far stronger than one that demanded belief. And, for the first time since her capture, she understood that the war was not only being fought on battlefields. It was being won quietly at breakfast tables. The thought followed her for days. It stayed with her during roll call, during work details, during the quiet hours when the camp seemed to hold its breath between routines. She found herself returning again and again to that Sunday morning, not as a memory of food, but as a measure, a way of understanding the country that held her. America, as she now saw it, did not feel hurried. Even at war, it moved with a kind of steadiness that was difficult to explain. Trains ran on time. Meals appeared when expected. Supplies arrived without drama. People argued, laughed, complained, but always with the underlying assumption that tomorrow would come and that it would resemble today closely enough to be trusted. That certainty was everywhere once she began to look for it. The guards spoke of brothers fighting overseas with confidence, not desperation. They believed those men would come home. They spoke of factories back east turning out planes and trucks in numbers she could barely imagine, not as miracles but as facts of life. Someone mentioned a plant that produced bombers around the clock as if that were simply what responsible countries did when challenged. In Germany, industry had been spoken of with reverence and fear. It was strained, desperate, driven by urgency that bordered on panic. Production numbers were announced like victories, each one masking how fragile the system had become. Here production was assumed. She thought of the breakfast again, how the pancakes had kept coming, how no one flinched at giving seconds. That abundance had not been reserved for special occasions or symbolic gestures. It was woven into the rhythm of daily life. This, she realized, was what victory looked like long before the war ended. Not triumphalism, not spectacle. Stability. America's strength did not announce itself with flags or slogans in the mess hall. It revealed itself in smaller ways, in the confidence to feed prisoners the same food as guards, in the absence of fear that such generosity would somehow weaken the nation. The people here trusted their systems. They trusted their neighbors. They trusted the future. That trust shaped everything. She began to notice how little effort Americans spent proving who they were. They did not speak constantly of their values. They lived them often without naming them at all. Fairness showed up in procedure. Dignity showed up in habit. Decency appeared not as an exception, but as default. The war for them was a disruption, not a transformation. She wondered what it must have felt like years earlier to grow up in such a place. To expect that food would be available, that Sundays would be preserved, that institutions would hold under pressure. To believe without irony that the country would still resemble itself when the crisis passed. In Germany, belief had been demanded. Here, belief was assumed. That difference explained more than any lecture ever could. As the days passed, she thought less about captivity and more about contrast. About how two modern nations had entered the same war with radically different foundations. One built on scarcity and obedience. The other on production and trust. One had needed constant reassurance of its own strength. The other had simply continued. The breakfast was not an anomaly. It was evidence. Years later, long after the war, long after she returned home, she would think back on that Sunday and realize why it remained so vivid. It was not because it was generous, it was because it was ordinary. That ordinariness spoke of a society that had solved problems most countries only reacted to. A society that could afford to be calm because it had prepared for the worst without surrendering its best instincts. When people later spoke of the greatest generation, she would understand what they meant not as mythology, but as lived reality. These were men and women who had faced catastrophe without abandoning routine, who had mobilized industry without dismantling daily life, who had gone to war without turning cruelty into habit. They had believed that civilization was not a luxury to be postponed until peace returned. It was the point. She sometimes wondered how America would be understood decades later when memories of that certainty faded. Whether people would still remember what it felt like to trust institutions, to share a sense of direction, to believe that disagreements did not threaten the fabric of the nation itself. The Sunday breakfast lingered as a quiet standard, a reminder of a time when strength did not feel defensive, when unity did not require uniformity. When a country knew who it was and did not panic when tested. No one had explained any of this to her. No one had tried to convince her. They had simply fed her. And in doing so, they had revealed the difference between a nation fighting to survive and one confident enough to endure. America then had been certain of itself, certain enough to treat even its enemies as temporary guests in a system built to outlast war. That certainty, she understood, was the most powerful weapon of all. The war ended without ceremony. There was no single moment that announced peace in a way that matched the years of noise that had come before it. Orders changed. Trains moved in new directions. Gates opened that had once been closed without explanation. One day she was told to pack what little she owned. Another day she was on a ship crossing the Atlantic in the opposite direction, watching the American shoreline disappear into the distance. She carried nothing back with her that anyone else would recognize as valuable. No souvenirs, no letters, no photographs. What she carried could not be searched or confiscated. Germany was quieter when she returned, but it was not whole. Buildings stood where streets used to be. Faces looked older than their years. Sundays existed again technically, but they did not feel the same. Food was scarce, trust was scarcer. Yet something inside her had changed. When she stood in line for rations, she remembered a morning in Arkansas when no one counted. When she heard people speak of enemies with certainty and bitterness, she remembered young men in uniform who talked about football and the weather while serving breakfast. When fear tried to take its old place in her chest, she remembered how easily it had been undone. By something as simple as pancakes. She spoke of it rarely, and only when asked. Not because the story was painful, but because it felt private, almost sacred. It did not fit the narratives people preferred. It was not about suffering or punishment or humiliation. It was about normalcy. Years passed. She built a life that looked modest from the outside and felt enormous from within. She had children. She taught them to value routines, to protect Sundays, to understand that strength was not proven by cruelty, but by restraint. When her grandchildren were old enough to ask about the war, she told them the truth, not all of it, but the part that mattered most. She told them that she had once been very afraid, and that fear had not been taken from her by force. It had been replaced. Decades later, across oceans and generations, the story reached other ears. The children of German prisoners listened and felt something unexpected settle in their chests: gratitude. Not because the past was forgiven, but because mercy had existed where none was required. Across the Atlantic, American families listened too. They heard about grandfathers who guarded camps, cooked meals, flipped pancakes without thinking twice. Men who never considered themselves heroes. Men who believed they were simply doing their jobs the right way. Some were surprised to learn that such ordinary acts had mattered so deeply. Others were not surprised at all. They recognized the country they had been raised to believe in. In the end, the legacy of that Sunday breakfast was not found in archives or medals or speeches. It lived in quiet acknowledgments passed down through families who would never meet, connected by a moment that asked nothing and changed everything. She never forgot that breakfast, not because it was generous, but because it was ordinary. America didn't defeat her with weapons. It defeated her fear with Sunday breakfast.